The issue with Trump, and this goes for his being a liability to political conservatives who are Jewish, being a liability to the Republican Party, being a liability to conservatism itself, is just his sheer recklessness. I think he is the only person who could reelect Biden.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. We have a wonderful program for you today. Discussions about anti-Semitism, Donald Trump, the future of conservatism, with commentary editor Abe Greenwald. But before we start, I want to encourage everyone to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, we would love to hear from you. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. We also want you to be aware that you don't have to wait a full week for more top story analysis anymore. I'm now offering a daily top story podcast so that I can share with you more news and analysis about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get podcasts. And now to today's program. There seems to be an emerging consensus within American Jewry that anti-Semitism is on the rise and a serious problem. But it remains deeply divided about the source of the problem and what to do about it. And at the center of this debate, as with so much else about contemporary American life, is politics and thoughts about former President Donald Trump. Now, liberals falsely accused Trump of anti-Semitism ever since he started running for president in 2015. The accusations reached a crescendo in 2020 when, during his battle for re-election, Jewish Democrats produced ads comparing his administration with Weimar Germany and even the Nazis. They never stopped lying about their claim that he had called the neo-Nazis who had marched in Charlottesville and Virginia in 2017 very fine people. And they claimed that all far-right anti-Semitism was somehow being encouraged by him because of his coarse political rhetoric. They ignored the fact that his had been the most pro-Israel administration in history, including the move of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, his holding the Palestinian Authority accountable for its support of terrorism, and the Abraham Accords, in which his foreign policy team achieved peace accords that his predecessors had considered impossible. He also deserved credit for doing more to combat anti-Semitism on American college campuses than any other president. But as he begins his quest to return to the White House in 2024, his loyal Jewish supporters are faced with a dilemma. Does gratitude for what he's done before compel them to ignore his dinner at his Mar-a-Lago resort with anti-Semitic rapper Kanye West and a gaggle of far-right extremist Holocaust deniers like Nick Fuentes, and his failure to condemn any of them for their hatred? The answer from the ranks of Trump supporters is mixed. Even some of the most ardent Trump loyalists, like his former lawyer David Friedman, who served as his ambassador to Israel, called on his old boss to disavow his dinner guests, but unsurprisingly, Trump, who never apologizes for anything he does or says, has refused. And indeed, Trump has, as he always has, merely moved on and didn't even reference the incident when he spoke at a conference of Orthodox educators last week, although he did say that he felt he was owed Jewish support, and on other recent occasions when he blasted Jews who had the temerity to criticize him as ungrateful. The problem is not just that Trump isn't prepared to acknowledge fault. It's that many of his supporters, who not unreasonably believe his media critics to be biased and untrustworthy after years of Russian collusion lies and other smears, are sounding as if there was nothing wrong with granting this kind of legitimacy to notorious hate mongers and anti-Semites at a time when anti-Semitism is on the rise, particularly in the African American community, and on both the far right and the far left. And Trump's Jewish supporters are so devoted to him that some are willing to excuse this as merely the price that must be paid for having a champion like him. Even before the dinner with West, the notion that Jews owed Trump their votes in 2024 was risible. He was and is owed gratitude for what he did in the White House, but not a lifetime get out of jail free card. Moreover, Trump's willingness to be cozy with Jew haters makes it hard for conservatives to hold President Joe Biden and the left accountable for their unwillingness to disavow anti-Semites on the left, like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, or to even acknowledge that Biden's policies are dangerous for Jewish safety. Biden's grandstanding on anti-Semitism since the West dinner is hypocritical, but it doesn't excuse Trump or absolve Jews from their obligation to call out anti-Semitism among their own allies. This is more than a dilemma for conservative Jews. After so many missteps and the evidence that his obsession with the 2020 election and his claims that he was cheated out of victory hurt the GOP in the midterm elections, that they should have won handily. It's clear that he regards his own petty self-interests and ego is more important than any cause, even saving the incompetence of President Joe Biden and his leftist administration. Like the pro-Israel community, the half of the American electorate that is conservative or leans to the right embraced Trump because of his accomplishments in office and understood that he was able to do so much despite the sabotage he faced from the administrative state and the media. But Trump's selfish obsessions and his bad judgment, which has been on display ever since he lost the 2020 elections, is now a political liability. Given the loyalty he retains among a critical mass of conservatives, he may still have the power to destroy any chance of defeating the Democrats in 2024, either by winning the GOP nomination or by refusing to accept defeat in the primaries and running as an independent or otherwise sabotaging anyone like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who might have a much better chance of beating Biden or whoever the Democrats put up. Unfortunately, the problem of Trump has also gotten mixed up in other, broader questions about the future of conservatism, as some of his critics have taken his current troubles as a reason to think the GOP can turn back the page to the conservatism of George W. Bush or even Paul Ryan and eschew the more populist beliefs that Trump embodied and which better represent the views of most Republican voters these days. While starting the post-Trump era as soon as possible is a necessity, it cannot mean a return to the ideas of a discredited establishment who are as uninterested in the cultural issues that drive GOP voters to the polls as before. If Republicans can't figure out how to get rid of Trump, but to hold on to the ideas and attitudes that motivate conservative and independent voters, then we may be in for at least 6 rather than 2 more years of intellectually bankrupt, woke leftist government in Washington. To discuss these questions, I'm very happy to have with me today an old friend and one of the keenest observers of politics, culture, and the Jewish world. Abe Greenwald is the executive editor of Commentary. Previously, he worked at the Foreign Policy Initiative. He's been published in the New York Post, the Wall Street Journal, and other newspapers and magazines. Abe Greenwald, welcome to Top Story.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. It's great to see you again. And thanks for joining us today. I want to start with the question that is bedeviling Jewish conservatives, and that is what to do about Donald Trump. Where does gratitude end and political realism as well as accountability begin when it comes to support for the most pro-Israel president in history, as well as a person who has now legitimized anti-Semites, and at least in my opinion, and maybe yours as well, is a political liability to his party? Where does anybody go from here with respect to him?
Right. I mean, I think what's interesting, I want to say at the outset about this, is that whatever Trump's mistakes, and they've been quite repulsive mistakes in terms of his legitimizing of anti-Semites and saying things that can be interpreted any number of offensive ways, regarding Jews and loyalty and allegiance. I don't think, and this is, as always when guessing about the black box that is Donald Trump's head, you're taking a risk. But I don't think the man himself is anti-Semitic in any way, and nor do I think he is particularly interested in advancing the goals of anti-Semites.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. I mean, in the piece that we just published in commentary, I took a deep dive into the four memoirs of the Trump aides that worked on the Abraham Accords, and some people like Jared Kushner and certainly David Friedman and Jason Greenblatt worked with him for a long time, are observant Jews, and whatever you can say about their prejudice, obviously they're prejudiced, that they're not objective about him, but they tell a story of a guy who is actually quite respectful of Judaism and of their Jewish observance. So it doesn't ring true, at least as far as that is concerned, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, it's just a point that always interests me because it doesn't. Because what I find interesting about Trump's gaffes in that direction, it's almost, with the exception of his dining with Kanye and white nationalists, it's almost when he says things about how Jews should appreciate him or appreciate Israel, it's almost as if he thinks he's one of them, one of us, and he could say these things because it makes common sense. It's sort of common sense to him.
Yeah, well,
In any event,
yeah, I mean, I'll just let me just chime in on that.
sure,
He's not wrong when he says that,
right,
the
right.
majority of Jews don't care that much about Israel and that evangelicals care more about it. Of course, we know that to be true. I mean, and he has it's taking him a long time to learn a lesson that many other politicians also take a long time to learn, because they're surrounded usually by pro-Israel advocates. Certainly Trump was surrounded in his business and his administration by Orthodox Jews who are ardently pro-Israel, and it's always seems to be a shock for him to find out that they're not representative of American Jewry.
Right, I think that's exactly right. But in any event, look, his most recent foray into legitimizing anti-Semitism and sort of normalizing it with Kanye and Nick Sanchez is repulsive, and it was important, and I think inevitable, that the Jewish leaders did push back, and said what they had to say, and should continue to say what they have to say. Um, uh, uh, the issue with Trump, and this goes for his being a liability to political conservatives who are Jewish, being a liability to the Republican Party, being a liability to conservatism itself, is just his sheer recklessness. And you can't afford to be reckless, carelessly reckless in defense of the Jewish people.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought you were about to quote The Godfather about you can't
Oh,
afford to
no.
be careless. But that's true too. Yeah, well, of course he is reckless in that respect. And, and he also, because he's not wrong to think that he generally doesn't get anything from apologizing or taking anything back. But as long as he doesn't confront, because, for me, the dinner with Kanye and Milo and Fuentes, unlike so many of the other, controversies about his supposed anti-Semitism, the Charlottesville remarks, which were really lied about, and all kinds of other things, Anti-Defamation League connecting dots, because his coarse political rhetoric is so mean, it's empowering people. Those were, I think, largely bogus arguments. I mean, they were basically, under the category of anybody I don't like is Hitler. But when you sit down with anti-Semites, especially in anti-Semites like Kanye West, who had been all over the headlines for anti-Semitism for the previous, several weeks before that dinner, you've got to ask, are you just so tunnel vision about your own ego and somebody's come to pay court to you that you don't understand? This is actually, for once, it was sort of like the left accused Trump of being authoritarian or anti-democratic for years, and it was always bogus. And then on January 6th, it gave them something it gave them a leg to stand on. And it's like with anti-Semitism, I feel the dinner with Kanye plays the same role. It's like it was a bogus argument, but then all of a sudden, it's not bogus.
I think that's an excellent point. There's almost, I think part of this almost has to do with a kind of trolling aspect, at least in terms of, like, let's say the January 6th stuff, where there is an impulse to become what your enemies are accusing you of being. It's as if, well, if I can't win no matter what, and if you want to call me that, then fine. That's what I am. Or you want to see what that really looks like, that kind of thing. Not that I think that's exactly what Trump. I think Trump just made a huge misstep here, which goes to show also who on earth is advising him. How could you end up sitting down with Kanye and Nick Fuentes after all that? And
yeah, that was interesting because I think even Steve Bannon and Sebastian Gorka were asking that question. It's like, if you've lost, Bannon and Gorka, and they're questioning like your judgment, then
I mean,
where do you go forward if you're Donald Trump if you've lost them?
it only occurs to me now. There's the vague ray of hope here is that he's been acting extraordinarily unserious in every way now, right? If you think of his recent digital trading cards with him as a superhero, and that's for sure. Yeah, I'm out of the NFT. I've never been in the NFT game. Yeah, so that in some sense, the fact that he is on such a remarkable string of own goals here, and just loss after loss after loss, whether it has to do with the midterm elections, his Mar-a-Lago problems, his January 6th problems, his the horrible end result of his dining with Kanye and Fuentes. He is losing, and that makes whatever he's up to less potent, which is, I think, a good thing. And in some sense, and this goes not just for concerned Jews, but for conservatives generally, don't push too hard on him when he's self-destructing. Let him. He's doing a good job on his own right now. Of sort of putting himself in the wilderness. I thought after the midterms, when Trump first came out and slammed DeSantis with the Ron DeSanctimonious line, and that was a big moment. And I said, "Oh, I wonder how DeSantis is going to handle this." And someone brought it up to DeSantis at a press conference, and I thought DeSantis was masterly in his response to it. He said, "Look, I am the most criticized governor in the country. I hear it constantly from the press, from everyone, all the time. But I'm results oriented. If you look at what I've done, my record speaks for itself. I work for the American people, and the rest is just noise." And I thought there's a real lesson there going forward in how to deal with Trump, at least for now, because for now Trump's kind of turning himself into a bit of a pipsqueak and a bit of a sideshow, and you don't want to risk elevating him, even though it would seem kind of hard to do at the moment. But you never know.
Well, I mean, I'm sure you hear from them as well as I do, but a lot of people are still, on his side. And I think it's due not only to the loyalty that he sort of earned from them by sort of championing the things that they care about, and that's very real, but it's also because they don't believe. I mean, a lot of Republicans and conservatives just don't believe anything that is said about him, no matter, even if it's true. And, that's after all the years of the Russia collusion hoax, lies, and everything else. I think certainly when the Mar-a-Lago, the sort of the classified document story came up, and we started getting all these, breathless CNN and MSNBC stories about, treason, nuclear codes, whatever. And I think the reaction, I have to say, my own reaction was, I don't believe any of this, because we've seen all of this before, and sort of, I, I, I worry that when he does something that actually is real, the reaction from a lot of people, sort of his core base is still there, and they aren't. There's no sign that they're going away, at least that I can see. As much as he is diminished, I think you're absolutely right.
Well, I think I don't know about his core base. I think there's some sign that he's losing favor among, let's say, the Republican base. Uh, in the current issue of Commentary, John Podhoretz, the editor, has a piece about the outcome of the midterms, and he sort of identifies these three groups on the right, which is sort of the Trump core and the Republican core, and then sort of everyone else, just conservatives. He'll always have something in that inner core. He'll always, he'll always be their guy. But I think if you are along for the issues, such as they are, that he represents, and even some of the fighting spirit, shall we say, that he represents, I think there's a lot of evidence that people are looking elsewhere. I mean, both in terms of polls. There were two polls that came out this past week, right? That had DeSantis more favorable than Trump by a fairly significant amount, and of course, anecdotally, I mean, all my hardcore Trumpiest friends, really to a person, have kind of said, "All right, enough. No mas." So I think there's some reason to hope, but if he can continue to make himself the news, and of course with the assistance of the media, who wants nothing else but for him to be in the spotlight, could he again elicit that kind of reflexive defensiveness among those who feel he's being persecuted? I don't know. It seems like a much heavier lift at this moment than I would have thought, say, the day before midterm elections.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he was certainly, he is, rightly blamed for some of the problems that Republicans had. Um, it's just a fact. Some of the choices that he imposed on the Republican Party, whether it was Dr. Oz or Herschel Walker, just really flopped in winnable races. So that's one part of it, and it's also the fact that he just can't seem to get beyond himself. But there's one more question in my mind of this. Even if you take, as John wrote in Commentary, the Trump core, and even if the Trump core is eroding, that may be big enough. I mean, it could still, in a multi candidate race, he could still, I'm I wouldn't put money on it, but right now, but in politics, you never know. He could still wind up being the GOP nominee. And even if he's beaten by someone like DeSantis, which seems like right now, more than a year before anything, matters, he could well hand the election to the Democrats by not accepting. When has he ever accepted defeat? He could claim that the primaries were fixed. I mean, it's almost certain that he will. And at that point, he could go independent or just spend the rest of the year trashing the Republicans and telling Republican voters to stay home. And in a divided country, a bifurcated political culture that we have, which I think we saw that really very well illustrated in the midterms, that would certainly be enough. I mean, to help, not just help the Democrats, but it could be that Trump is the only person who can reelect Biden.
I think he is the only person who could reelect Biden, which is not to say I think he will do it, but I think you're right. I think no matter what he does, he is a drag on the Republican Party. I think that is a sort of phenomenal reality about this. One of the interesting things about what Trump does now, though, is that I think for such a long time he didn't have. He was the only game in town in terms of public enemy number one. Um, he was the guy that everyone, there was it was he was the evil villain, everyone's evil villain. He's got some competition there, and now in the public imagination, and that helps him. Uh,
In the
namely,
Democratic imagination, for sure.
absolutely, but Elon Musk, sort of swooping in out of nowhere is now become a sort of a target in similar ways to the way Trump was. But um, so yeah, the question is
Yeah,
if
not to
he
mention the fact that it seems like every liberal magazine has an article every other day about why DeSantis is really an idiot or why DeSantis is really politically weak, all of which adds up to their fear that he's not an idiot and is by no means weak. He's very strong and they're afraid of him, which is why they're writing about him so much.
right or you get the which was inevitable. You get the line that if you thought Trump was scary, wait, DeSantis, he's really scary because he's all the terrible apocalyptic things that you worried about with Trump, but he can make it happen. He's capable and he's smart and he knows the game. So yeah, so they definitely do fear him. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so to just, dial back a little bit to the question of anti-Semitism, I think, part of the reason why the Kanye West thing was so confounding is that it's really very hard for some people to realize, that, Republicans can't go after Biden on the squad on Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar when Trump won't disavow Kanye Fuentes and Milo. It's the tunnel vision that exists where, Democrats are good at condemning, right-wing anti-Semitism, but will never acknowledge it on the left and their own allies. And as we see that Biden, hosts and praises Omar and Tlaib, and a lot of Republicans just don't want to acknowledge anti-Semitism on the right either.
Yeah, I mean, look, the maddening thing about the one of the many maddening things about the rising instances of anti-Semitism is that each case, each incident, each attack, each offensive statement is only considered in terms of its political utility. And by the way, this is just to take it away from Trump for a second and put it on Kanye West here. The only reason that there was the outcry that there was against Kanye for this is because he supported Donald Trump.
Right.
There are
And Tucker Carlson loves him.
Well, yeah, right, exactly. Well, yeah, because of his associations, yeah, on the right. But in truth, Kanye represents a strain of anti-Semitism in the hip hop community. All sorts of characters have been overt in their robust defense of Louis Farrakhan. People like, let's say, Snoop Dogg, who is embraced as a sort of cuddly, cultural figure now who gets he can do a show with Martha
He sells
Stewart.
beer on TV
Yeah,
commercials during games. Yeah.
right. So all of this is only treated for its political utility. Yeah, and the horrible thing is that because the Democrats, because the left have never addressed their anti-Semitic squad problem, when Trump does something or someone on the right does something, it allows those people's defenders on the right to sidestep it, to what about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, whataboutism is the way we discuss anti-Semitism, no matter where you are on the spectrum. It's like you're concerned about Ilhan Omar. What about Trump? Well, and vice versa. It's an endless loop. But I think you hit on something really important when you talk about Kanye West and how representative he is, and how broad support for Farrakhan is in a lot of the African American community. I mean, even something like the whole controversy about Dave Chappelle and at his Saturday Night Live routine. Sort of the takeaway for me wasn't was it funny, was it not, whatever. It's that he was dismissing the idea of black anti-Semitism, and the studio audience was dutifully laughing along with him. And they're all just sitting a subway ride away from a place where there is an epidemic of anti-Semitism, of African Americans attacking, Orthodox Jews, and everybody treats it like it's not happening.
I think it's funny. I mean, I haven't really spoken much about the Chapelle thing. I think it's an interesting case for a number of reasons. Um, One, it's sort of tricky because as a conservative, I don't believe that we should hold comics to account for their speech in the same way we do people talking about policy proposals and making serious commentary on our political and social lives. And I don't want to get into the cancel game. Um, so as far as I'm concerned, his act is his act, and to the extent that what he said is not true, to me, it's not funny because humor works. It has to be true to work. Um, what I found truly offensive, to be honest, the only thing I found truly offensive in what he said wasn't a joke. It was when he said, he sort of spoke to Jewish people and said, look, listen, Jewish people, you can't blame your problems on black Americans. And that was preposterous because that is, of course, precisely what Kanye West was doing in regard to, he was the whole Kanye West, who was the starting point for the routine, was blaming whatever his madhouse problems are on the Jews. And I thought that wasn't, it was almost sort of outside of the routine entirely. Regarding the fact that there is this, and has been for years, this epidemic of violent anti-Semitism, overwhelmingly perpetrated by African Americans in, say, Brooklyn against the Orthodox community. My Orthodox friends and my Hasidic friends, and you've probably had some of this too. When the Kanye news broke, their attitude was, What's the big deal? We get this. We know about this all our lives. We get this every day. You think this is new? You think this is going to start something? It started. It started ages ago. You're only hearing about it.
Yeah, but since it's a form of anti-Semitism that can't be blamed on Donald Trump or Republicans, we don't really generally read about it in the New York Times or hear about it on CNN and MSNBC, do we?
No, well, it can't be blamed on Republicans. To talk about it, you have to talk about black violent crime rates, which the same people don't want to talk about. It can't be blamed on Israel. It serves no purpose for most mainstream media types. So it completely gets ignored. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to ask, get your take on one thing. It's a controversy that's coming up, although it's already started. Kevin McCarthy, who is still presumed to be the the next House Speaker, if he can, get his caucus together, or has promised to throw Ilhan Omar off of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where she's been since for the last 4 years, and it's seen as partly tit for tat for the Democrats throwing Marjorie Taylor Greene off of all committees, and therefore it's seen as wrong. Democrats have rallied around Ilhan Omar. Jewish left wingers have rallied around her. Even J Street, who claims to be pro-Israel. But the question is, and the truth is, McCarthy started this business of throwing people off of committees when he did it to Steve King in January 2019, in order to get who was right-wing extremist, and that gave him the high ground against Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, who are BDS supporters and open anti-Semites. But Democrats just said, it's not the same thing. And do you think he should go through with this, assuming he gets to be Speaker? And where does this end with this throwing people off of committees? Is there something kind of not kosher about about this. These people have been elected. They're entitled to, their voters are entitled to representation, or should the House just start throwing people out that, the majority doesn't like?
Well, I think it
Even
feeds
when they're really
into
repulsive and anti-Semites or extremists.
well, I think it feeds into what we were talking about before, about the political utility of each instance of anti-Semitism, right? So, what's not kosher about it to me is that it's a kind of partisan football now, and that's what it's about, and it's not really about her anti-Semitism. Of course, the Democrats were the ones; they had the chance to actually render a judgment on her with a censure, and they backed away. Um, and everyone has to clean up their own house ultimately. I think which is not to say you don't push back and fight and get Jew haters out of power to the best of your ability, but it will not. This would clean up nothing. It would advance the tit for tat. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think it goes to the same thing we've been talking about anti-Semitism existing on both ends of the spectrum. Muslims, blacks, Dems can't do it, but it seems Republicans are finding it just as hard. But let's sort of broaden our lens. We've talked about the problems for, the Donald Trump problem for Republicans, but it's broader than just that. What's the future for conservatism? Commentary is one of the sort of the thought leaders in American conservatism. The question is, what is the future? I mean, obviously, Trump changed the Republican Party. And the Republican, he in part reflected dissatisfaction with the sort of old Bush establishment. And there's still some people, certainly in Washington, who would like to go back to business as usual, sort of the world of Paul Ryan, whom, we all, conservatives once really liked, but sort of his message fell flat. He fell flat as speaker. And I think there are a lot of people who are not comfortable with sort of a more populist conservatism or the culture wars. Even though someone like DeSantis, I think, has thrived because he is a culture warrior. The question is, can, we do this kind of conservatism without Trump? I think DeSantis provides a formula, but it's not clear that everybody's going along with that.
Oh no, it's a fascinating point actually in conservatism, because not only do you have this populist split from traditional conservatism or the conservatism the pre-Trump American conservatism, but now there is a split among the populists, at least a split, if not more than one, where the so-called NatCons, national conservatives, and the TradCons, the traditional conservatives, who have a sort of more religious framework, are arguing among themselves about things like the virtues of nationalism, about letting in LGBTQ people into the movement or not. So it is sort of in some ways growing ever smaller, I think, in ways that make me hopeful if they're going to fight among themselves. There's no going back, generally speaking, right? I mean, you can't. You're if someone's fantasy was to recreate the pre-Trump conservatism nuts and bolts as it was, that it's an impossibility.
The Bill Kristol era of Washington conservatism, if
right,
we will,
that absolutely cannot happen.
We both know,
right,
and who has now abandoned conservatism. So
entirely, yes. But I think there's going to be some sort of hybridization, and who knows what that looks like. I think one of the things that I think is here to stay, at least for a while, about conservatism, and this was a sort of underappreciated aspect of Trump's appeal, or sort of not quite captured, is that conservatives, the populist conservatives right now, they look like or they have been looking like sort of the only people who can talk about politics, the only people who are having fun, because they've decided that all the official stories are nonsense, and that who cares who's offended, so the sort of the yoke of the conservative temperament has been thrown off, and I think there's going to be something of that remains going forward, no matter what. Um, the nastiness and the sort of below the belt stuff um, should go. We'll see. I think DeSantis is an interesting admixture here. There's sort of two DeSantises. There's the boring, good governance DeSantis, and there's the culture war,
which is a refreshing contrast with Trump, who,
right,
even though in many ways a very successful conservative president, it was chaos with Trump.
And I think he, in some sense, represents. Fun is the sort of the wrong word, but it's not a buttoned up conservatism, and that is what it had been. But DeSantis's conservatism isn't vulgar either. So it's Florida as the capital of freedom. It's the free state. It's where you get to go and pursue happiness and not be bothered, not be scolded, and not listen to functionaries who want to control your life. That's good. That's a winning message, I think, if he can. And it would be, there's a lot there for the various strains, But who knows? Look, a lot of this is going to be shaped by, we're going to be talking about things in 6 months from now or a year from now that we can't even see coming. There are going to be new issues, new crises, and there are going to be responses to them, and movements and counter movements will swirl around these, and we'll see how they shape the movement.
Yeah, well, that's true. Ideas are what have driven the debate. They will drive the debate. And, questions about, talking about one of the things that DeSantis was able to capture, because he tapped into anger on the right and even in the center about things like critical race theory, about, indoctrination in the schools, these cultural issues where wokeism has run amok and has taken over so much of our culture, certainly popular culture, the academy, much of the government now, certainly with Biden. So, you wrote back in February in commentary about the way both, sort of corporations and the schools had been co-opted by woke leftism. And, to me, this is a much more important issue than sort of which guy gets to be president, or who's, whether the party that controls Congress has an R or a D after it. And to the extent that we can get politicians to care about these issues, which it seems that some cultural conservatives have credibility on this issue, that's really what it's about. That's the most important thing going on. And the question is, is there a way to combat these trends when the educated classes seem to be circling the wagons behind these terrible ideas?
Well, in that piece in February, I think there was, some encouraging signs about a pushback on these woke initiatives that really took off like wildfire in 2020. We had a few months of lockdown, then George Floyd was killed, and then the country sort of turned on its head, and everyone, everyone started, reading White Fragility and having to sit down for diversity training and whatever else. But I think the encouraging signs are there, and I think the way that we have seen some politicians push back, and surprisingly, what we've seen is that on things like defund the police, right, which is a movement that was part of all this and came out of all the 2020 eruptions. Liberal Democratic politicians, 1 year later, by 2021, when that November, we're saying this is enough. We got to take back the streets. The crime is overwhelming. We got to fund the cops again. And voters, and in places like Virginia, They saw what was being taught in the schools. It was you could no longer tell people not to believe the evidence of their own eyes and their own senses, and they did push back. And I think we will see more and more of that, and that it is the most important thing. I think the corporate part is the hardest. The corporate wokeness is the hardest bit to undo, the hardest bit to unwind, because they're not accountable in the ways that politicians are. Politicians, if they're scared they're going to lose, they'll turn on a dime, and they'll back away from something. Corporations that don't, they're beholden to a whole different set of concerns, and for the millions of Americans who have to sort of deal with some kind of woke indoctrination as part of their daily jobs. They're in for a continued long haul, I think.
Yeah, well, I think you were absolutely right. There were so many encouraging signs, but I'm a little discouraged because Republicans weren't running on that in this past fall. They seem to have forgotten it. I mean, just sort of like politicians have the have the memory of a 3-year-old. That's part of it, but it's also that it sort of just moved on, and yet these ideas still have their are still they still have a hold on so many institutions. I mean, one of the most discouraging things of the last 2 years is the way that Biden's executive order, on the first one of his orders on the first day about putting in a DEI, the woke catechism of diversity, equity, and in inclusion. Excuse me, I was not including inclusion. That every government department now has a DEI plan and a DEI commissar working on it. And indeed, that's spread throughout, the culture. I mean, just in sort of, I care about classical music. I can tell you every orchestra, every opera company in this country has a woke commissar, guiding, the people running things from a DEI catechism perspective, influencing hiring, influencing choices of what they do on everything. And, how do you undo that when the culture has embraced it? And that's why I think politicians have to at least lead on this. They have to lean into these issues, and to keep fighting on it. That's why DeSantis's fight with Disney was so instructive, because of course when you push back at them, they fold. Most Americans don't want this stuff, but politicians don't lead on it.
But
This insidious force continues to grow.
I think it's important to link this up to the earlier part of our conversation about Trump, actually, because part of why the right politicians weren't pushing back forcefully and constructively on this issue is because they were preoccupied with fighting Trump's fights, right? This was back when, the Stop the Steal was in full swing, and that, instead of attacking Democrats and liberals for instituting this kind of cultural revolution in the country, they were fighting them for unjustly persecuting Donald Trump, and so he's been a drag on the Republicans, in not just electorally but also in terms of priorities, tremendously. There has been so much room to attack the Democrats on these issues, and it's like fishing over a swarm of fish and not putting your rod in the water, because Trump's the captain.
Abe, now turning our view abroad for a moment, is there still a coherent neoconservative approach to foreign policy after Iraq and Afghanistan, and the sort of decline in interest in democracy promotion abroad for, I think, understandable reasons? And where do you think Ukraine fits into this equation, both in terms of American foreign policy and national interest and democracy?
Well, I think it's important to note that there was really never a cohesive neoconservatism approach to foreign policy to begin with. As people like Irving Kristol would say, neoconservatism was a sort of a tendency or a leaning. It wasn't a sort of a reified uh, thing, that an agreed upon approach to everything. In fact, all the neocons I've ever worked with, varying opinions on all sorts of matters, including foreign policy. But basically, if the idea is that, and it's also, I think, too misunderstood as being synonymous with democracy promotion or sort of rampant, impulsive, idealistic democracy promotion, for reasons, as you say, that I understand, having to do with Iraq and whatnot. But I think if the basic idea is um, the U.S. should help free people uh, defend their freedom when it also helps the U.S. And when it's possible, I think that is very much alive and well. That the U.S. should um, have a robust, forward-leaning foreign policy and military posture to prevent conflict, not to get into unnecessary, unwanted slogs. I think that very much remains in place. And I have to say, um, whatever you call that framework and that paradigm, um, you don't have to call it neoconservatism, but looking at things like Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan and the disastrous results of that, and the sort of cascading effect, I think that you can tie to that, and looking at what Vladimir Putin thought, looking on and saying, "Oh well, America's out of the world policing game. This is a good opportunity for me," and that, and given um, the American people's overwhelming support, which is still quite high for the cause of the Ukrainian people. It doesn't matter what you call it, um, but I think, yeah, there's still very much a place for a forward-leaning, um, freedom-conscious American foreign policy, for sure. We also see it now in seemingly the sort of the end of the Iran negotiations, right? I mean, this was a big neocon cause of the whole time, that since Barack Obama had been trying since he got the JCPOA to happen, and throughout Biden's term trying to reinstate it. That's all fallen apart. So I think there's a certain reality reflected in foreign policy and on the world stage and dealing with bad actors, that there's always going to be some sort of return to an understanding that we have serious enemies out there. It would be nice to ignore them as much as we could. It would be nice to extend our hands to them and try to be sort of a realist about all of it. I mean, realist in the foreign policy terms. But in fact, sometimes you maintaining peace requires something more aggressive and more involved.
Yeah, well, I think that it's certainly true. The idea that America needs to be strong and not be perceived as weak, and willing to stand up for its friends, always makes sense. I mean, that didn't used to be called neoconservatism; just used to be just sort of practical American self-interest. Um, and it's not clear to me that human rights concerns are that important to I think it's an inconvenience for Biden with Iran right now, because they're stuck in a position where they'd still like to revive their appeasement policy, but the Iranians, A, aren't interested, and B, are distracted by their internal battles. But it's not clear to me that certainly the Biden administration wants to be strong against Iran. Too many people on their foreign policy team are still invested in the sort of Obama notion that Iran should be, rapprochement with Iran is the way to go. as opposed to strengthening the alliance between Israel and the Arab states, which Trump emphasized. I mean, if they were serious about defending American interests in the Middle East, they'd be now pushing for another Abraham Accords. They don't seem to have much of a coherent approach to this because number one, because they keep failing. Number two, because, in part, and they had another motivation for doing a deal with Iran because they thought it would help them pursue Ukraine, which in their minds, and perhaps in the minds of, I think, a lot of Americans, certainly on the left, is bound up with their belief about Russia, collusion, Trump, and how it all got mixed up with impeachment. I mean, it all got muddled, didn't it?
Oh, I agree. And my point on Iran is that the neocons were right. It's the neocons who were saying there is no legitimate partner here. You're not going to get whatever you think this is. There's no deal to be had. There may be a hoax to be had that someone will call a deal, but as it
happened in 2015 for sure.
Right. But this is not what Barack Obama saw in Tehran, which was he believed a sort of just a country waiting to be rehabilitated by the
right with the world.
West, Yeah, right, exactly. So yeah, no, that's all I meant about that.
Yeah, well, I think we've covered a lot of ground. There's a lot more that we can discuss, but we're about out of time. Abe, I want to thank you so much for coming on today. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, or later on JBS TV, please like and or subscribe to Top Story. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.